You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here to recap and wind up our long series on the flood boundary. Paul, this is the longest. This has been a 4-part series, and we're finally coming down to the end here. I don't think we've solved anything.
Right. Yeah. I think this is the longest consecutive series we've done.
Correct.
Yeah. But I found it very interesting. Very useful to kind of, to sort of hear from two different people about the different positions that they hold. So it's given us lots of things to think about, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say to our listeners, our audience out there, whoever you are, we'd like your feedback on this format. This is the first time as Paul said, this is the first time we've done an extended series, one right after the other. We felt like, we liked the idea and we felt like we could do it. So we did it. But if you feel like you prefer intermittent series more than the sustained consecutive series, let us know. If you like the consecutive series, maybe we'll find another subject to record another series of interviews on. Maybe we'll try this again in a year or two, or maybe in the fall. I don't know. If you like it, maybe we'll do it again. But we need to know if you like it. So, shoot us an email, podcast@coresci.org. Send us comments on social media. Go, if you're watching YouTube, just scroll down and leave us a comment right there. Let us know what you think. And wherever you are, do remember to like and subscribe and review, whatever you can do. All that interaction helps us out, helps us bump up in the algorithm, that ever powerful algorithm that makes or breaks our fate on YouTube and all the social media platforms. We need to defeat it. And so help us out by interacting with our content. We would very much appreciate that. Also, make a donation. So you can find out more at letstalkcreation.org, where you can find out how you can support the podcast. If you've really enjoyed what we're doing, then do consider supporting us in the work that we're doing. Paul, this is kind of a grind. We release every 2 weeks. There are no seasons or series, right? We just crank it out every 2 weeks. So it's a lot of work, and so we do appreciate that support. So with all of that said, let's get back to the subject at hand. So we decided deliberately with this series that we were not going to have a debate. This is kind of an anti-debate. I've been thinking about that issue a lot lately. And one of the things I think that happens when you see sort of a debate that sort of spirals off into yelling and fist waving and angry people shouting at each other, for myself anyway, I feel like I get the most frustrated and the most emotional when I see that the person I'm talking to is not listening to me. That they are, in fact, formulating their next statement, whatever it is. They've heard a trigger word or whatever, and now they are going to construct their response and then give it to me. I do it myself. It's not great. Paul, you feel like that sometimes, maybe? I don't know.
Yes, we can get so caught up in sort of defending our own position that we don't really hear what the other person is saying.
Yeah.
And we've been very conscious, I think, on this podcast that we have wanted to think carefully about difficult questions and not easily leap to conclusions, and recognize the complexity of some of the questions that we're dealing with. And this is one of them.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to shed more light than heat by consciously making this something other than a debate. So I hope we've succeeded. I hope that people have found it helpful, and to hear two very articulate proponents of these different positions set out their stall.
Right. Yeah. So that's a lot of motivation for why we decided to have different episodes altogether. We didn't just want people listening to formulate their arguments. And obviously I can't control how the audience is listening. But we can control a little bit of how we present things, intentionally listening and trying to hear and not trying to understand. And I know that some of you listening are oftentimes find yourself uncomfortable with our unwillingness to jump to conclusions. Sorry, not sorry. Sorry you feel uncomfortable, but I'm not sorry that we're sort of dragging our feet on jumping to conclusions. So we're going to wrap this up today and try to come up with some thoughts of our own, maybe, and maybe some reflection on what each of our guests have said. And we're not going to declare a winner. I don't feel like there is a winner. Myself, I just don't know. In terms of what we've said here. So to remind our audience, we're talking about the flood, right? We're talking about, okay, so there is a global flood that left evidence in what we understand to be the geologic column, the rock record, right? And the question is, okay, so does the flood leave behind most of the rock record so that we could say, oh, if it's a fossil, it's probably from the flood? Or are there some rock layers that are from after the flood? And if so, what are they, right? So we've had two guests on. The first guest we had was Dr. Tim Clary from the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Clary has spent a lot of time in industry working on geology questions, and he's also spent a lot of time now at ICR working on studying large-scale patterns of the rock record. And his position is basically kind of like what creationists of the early 20th century would have thought about these things. And they basically argued that, it looks like most of the fossil record is caused by the flood. So that he would say, well, the flood, the boundary between rocks that are formed by the flood and the rocks formed after the flood, that occurs high up in the rock column, in the geologic column. Our second guest was Dr. Marcus Ross, who we've had on a couple of times. Dr. Ross is a paleontologist who is a geological paleontologist, I should say. So he didn't come to paleontology through a biology training. He came to it through a geology training. And so he's looking at various features of what he finds in the fossil record, and he's arguing, no, I think it's lower. I think it's more like what is now called the KPG boundary, which would be the transition between what you would understand to be the time of the dinosaurs, right? The extinction of the dinosaurs, if you put it in sort of conventional terms. And the age of mammals. So the Cenozoic is after the flood, and the Mesozoic is in the flood. And the transition between the two is the transition of flood rock to post-flood rock. I hope that's mostly clear. I know this is kind of complicated if you are a regular member of the audience and are not really up to snuff on your geology. you might have been really scratching your head at a lot of some of the things that have been going on the past couple episodes. Yeah, I understand. I've been feeling very similar.
Yeah, it's hard to avoid the jargon when you're talking about these different positions, because you've got to relate it to terms, that are used to describe the geological column. So we've got this term sort of Cenozoic. In conventional terms, that's basically everything from 66 million years ago to the present day. In the conventional terms,
right.
So Marcus thinks all of that is post-flood. Whereas Tim's position is to put it much higher. So Tim would put the boundary somewhere about, in conventional radiometric dates, about 2.6 million years ago. So that's quite a significant difference. A difference between 66 million years ago and 2.6 million years ago.
Huge difference.
So there's a big chunk. There's a big chunk of the geological record that is kind of under dispute here.
Right.
Is that flood or is that post-flood?
Right. Yeah. And I'm reminded of, I just thought of this. I'm not prepared. There's a great verse in Proverbs. I'm going to give you Todd's paraphrase of that verse. This guy seems right until you hear from the other guy. So if you are a not a geologist and you're hearing this, I think that may have summarized some of your feelings on these episodes where you think, oh, that sounds pretty good, and then the other guy talks and you think, oh, that sounds pretty good too. And yeah, and how to adjudicate between the two is going to be really, really challenging thing. Okay. So with all that said, let's see if we can summarize some of the points. I've got my notes here. Some of the points that each of our guests made. And let's try to do this fairly, give them a fair assessment, a fair summary. And please, folks, if you're watching, Dr. Clary and Dr. Ross, correct us if we're wrong. Put comments down, send us an email, whatever, because we want to make sure that we get this right. So my understanding from Tim's interview, I made, let's see, kind of 3 or 4 major points that he wanted to make. The big one for me was this question of volume of rock. So this involved a lot of work studying published records of rock layers from a lot of different places. I'm not even sure exactly where all he's been, but he's essentially gone through and said, okay, well, here's the lateral extent of these rock layers, and they're this thick, right? And so using that information, you can estimate how much rock has been deposited in that layer, right? And so he finds that the Cenozoic rock, the volume of rocks in the Cenozoic, this is the stuff that's under dispute, right? Is it flood or is it post-flood? He finds that volume is gigantic. It's massive in the sense of being more than the Mesozoic, where you find all the dinosaur fossils. So from my understanding of his point there is that, well, that much volume looks like it needs a really big source, right? And if you have a flood that produces the dinosaur layers, then why would you stop and say it didn't produce the stuff on top, which is even more volume than the dinosaur layers itself? Have I got that mostly right, Paul? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And so Tim referred to some examples like this very large offshore sand body called the Whopper Sand.
Right.
And he referred to very thick coal seams in the Powder River Basin. And you're right, he says there's more Cenozoic sediment by volume than any other time interval in the standard geological column. And so he feels that such a large volume of sediments has to be explained by the flood, that it
Yeah.
Couldn't be post-flood.
Yeah.
So that's basically,
And it
the
kind
argument
of,
as I understand it.
I feel like that kind of makes sense, right? Here we're going back to the one
Right.
guy makes sense until the other guy speaks. That makes sense to me, that a global flood, we ought to be looking for something huge. Is that reasonable? I guess that's reasonable. So that's one of his points. Another one of his points that he raises, and I would say that that's more of a, how would you say that? More of a positive point in his favor. And then he's got this other point here, which I would say sort of straddles the positive negative, right? Because he says, look at all of the stuff that's happening in tectonics in the Cenozoic. And so sort of the easiest way I can put this into terms that the audience could really grasp, the Atlantic Ocean essentially opens up in the Cenozoic. So, that's huge. I hope you can really understand what that means, right? So the rock, the different continents are moving around during the flood, fine. And then the rocks that we find at the bottom of the ocean are essentially Cenozoic rocks. The bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, I should say. The Atlantic Ocean. So that the Atlantic seems to have opened up and formed during the Cenozoic. And Tim says that's a global catastrophe. That is a thing that you don't just survive. It's not a thing that you can have happen when there are animals and people running around. That is a global disaster. And as a result, we need a global mechanism to explain that. And so he's looking at the record of tectonic changes, and he says, when it sort of slows down, becomes safe for people to go out of the ark, it's going to be higher than the KPG boundary. It's got to be up closer to the Ice Age than the Ice Age being the most recent stuff at the top. So it's closer to that than it is to the KPG boundary. Have I got that kind of right?
Yeah, so he's drawing here on particularly John Baumgartner's idea of rapid subduction and rapid production of ocean floor during the flood. And I think Tim's point was that if you look at the currently existing ocean crust, about a third to a half of all of the ocean crust that we currently have was produced in the Cenozoic. And, Tim said that's something that it's very hard to see how that could happen after the flood, because you would get, with rapid tectonics like that, you would get tsunamis and massive earthquakes. And, this seems something that is easier to understand as happening during the flood than after the flood.
Right.
And I guess we also have to think about the mechanism. What is that? Because I think the way that John Baumgartner sort of expounds his model of CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, this is a mechanism that operates during the flood until all of the pre-flood ocean floor is consumed. And then the mechanism kind of stops. You no longer have the density difference between the ocean floor and the underlying mantle. And so in effect, this rapid plate, these rapid plate motions stop.
Right.
So how do you sustain that through maybe a few hundred years of the early post-flood period? So it's a significant question. It's a significant challenge.
Yeah. And I say that it's kind of positive and negative in the sense that it's sort of positive in the sense that you're saying, like what you just said, that the mechanism, that this catastrophic plate tectonic mechanism of changing the continents around during the flood, that has a driving force that seems to sort of run out of gas, right? And so his positive point is it runs out of gas, and so we need to put most of that tectonic stuff in the flood, which makes sense to me. And sort of negative side of it is that he says, if this is after the flood, how is everything surviving? How is this possible that you can have all this stuff going on after the flood, right? So there's a dual positive negative argument. Another one of his arguments, and this is one that I found really, really interesting, and I've been sort of running into myself, trying to sort through archaeology and paleoanthropology and that weird interface between the two. He pointed out that there's basically no Middle East at the boundary, at the KPG boundary, right? Tectonically speaking, there is no Middle East. So you have Noah and company landing in the mountains of Ararat. Based on linguistics, based on long tradition, we pretty much know there is a mountainous region quite a bit to the north of Israel, called in the ancient, it was the Assyrians called it Urartu, and that's where this is. So we know when Genesis says Ararat, this is the mountains they're talking about. And the difficulty is that you don't have, there's no Babylon, there's nothing there at that time. So if you travel south from there is no Middle East for the setting of the next bunch of stories, right? So Abraham moves from Ur down to the Promised Land, right? There is no Promised Land, and it sort of gets magnified if you look at, for example, some of the pyramids. This is something that I was made vividly aware of recently. One of my Facebook friends had visited Egypt and brought back photographs of fossils in the limestone blocks that make up the pyramids. And this is all Cenozoic limestone, right? So how is it possible? How is it possible that there is the formation of this limestone after the flood, and pyramids start to be built? They're starting to use the limestone in Egypt to make things. When we know that Egypt arrives on the scene really early. And archaeologically, we can see, okay, well, they started building pyramids about this time period, and we know this pyramid dates to this period, and so we know when they're building pyramids. So, yeah, it's a real tricky business there, as I'm trying to think through how this works.
Yeah.
The timing seems real rushed.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because if as Tim argues, if the flood boundary is earlier in the record, if it's around the end of the Cretaceous, then much of North Africa and the Middle East is still underwater at that point. You've got extensive deposition of limestones across this region, so there's no dry land for Noah and his family to come out of the ark and
right.
And colonize and settle. And Tim, says most of that region is then still underwater until well into the Cenozoic, until about, I think he said, the sort of middle upper part of the Miocene. And so, his argument is the post-flood boundary's got to be higher than that in the record. There's just no dry land there.
Yeah. So I think those were his main points in favor of his position.
There was one other thing that he mentioned, which were, again, was a kind of, it was on like you say, on that boundary of sort of positive, negative evidence, but it was about the distribution of animals after the flood. Mm-hmm. So, if the end of the flood is around the KPG boundary, the continents are still fairly widely separated at that point. And so Tim said, how did animals coming from the ark, particularly large mammals, basically disperse to these sort of widely separated continents, these widely separated regions, unless they had land bridges to cross these oceanic barriers, and the land bridges don't really come into existence until the sea level drops as a result of the ice age, because obviously when you have large ice sheets forming on the continents, water from the oceans is then being locked up in those ice sheets.
Yes.
Sea level drops, and areas that are currently underwater become exposed as dry land. And so you have bridges that animals can cross to distribute.
Right.
And Tim's argument is, how does that happen if the flood ends earlier when you don't have those land bridges?
Yeah.
So,
and we have lots of those, just to make sure that the audience understands this. So for example, horses, right? Horses, we had in Eurasia, we have zebras in Africa, right? But when the European explorers arrived in the Americas, there were no horses. There were no horses at all. But when you look in the fossil record, all the horses, well, not all the horses, but most of the early horses are in North America. So that's weird. How did they get there? And that's in the Cenozoic, right? So if the Cenozoic is telling us something about the post-flood, well, then we have to raise the question of how did the animals get across whatever ocean there was to North America and not establish themselves in the old world, right? So horses moved immediately to North America, diversified, and then they came back and settled Eurasia, and then they went extinct in North America, so that only Eurasia and Africa today have native horses. So that's a legitimate question as well. Okay, so those are some of the main points. I know in their writings that in his writings Tim has made other points. But those are the big ones that I remember from the interview, and I don't want to.
I think that's right.
Go too far off into the weeds on stuff that's
no. I think you summed it up well. I think those are those are kind of the key points that Tim presented. Yeah.
Okay, then on to Marcus. So Marcus had a lot to say, and a lot of it was technical, and a lot of it was sort of reviewing the literature of the debate and how this debate has been going. The big thing that I remember from Marcus that was very clear was that the change from Mesozoic to Cenozoic, that KPG boundary, also represents a significant change in the nature of the rocks and the deposits of the rocks. So, and let's see if I can explain this well. So in the Mesozoic, you would find a rock layer, for example, that covers all of the western United States. You might even find, if you go down even further, and again, I'm showing my ignorance here, but you go to the Permian, and you know about this, Paul, you find sandstones everywhere. And so that seems to suggest that you have something really huge on the continents making a continuous deposit across entire continents, multiple continents. Whereas when you get to the Cenozoic, you get things that are much more limited in scope. So it may be that the volume becomes bigger, but the geographic range of things becomes smaller. So that, in fact, you might find a deposit of say, something in the Miocene or something that covers half of Wyoming. I'm making this up. I don't know if that's true. But it covers half of one of our U.S. states. Maybe it only covers the bottom part of England. Maybe there's only a part of it on certain island in Scotland. I don't know. But it's very localized, right? It may be very thick and impressive, and you might think, wow, something really big must have happened here. But it's not something that you would find that you could follow onto, say, the continent of Europe or across all of North America. And in that respect, that seems like something's changing there in the way the rocks are being deposited from what we saw below the KPG to what we see above. The other thing that he noted about it was that the sorts of things that you associate with the flood, right? Marine animals tend to start disappearing. And it's not a hard boundary, right? It's not that you never find sharks or sea stars or whatever in the Cenozoic. It's that the frequency of these sorts of things starts to change dramatically. And what you get instead are things that look like they were deposited, that look like they were terrestrial environments. You have surfaces that look like they were exposed to weathering. You find animal fossils that look like they just sort of laid down and died there and got buried by something. And this happens throughout the Cenozoic. And so it makes it difficult to say the Cenozoic must be before the flood, because if there are land animals, right, that look like they're living on the land, then they probably came at that late point in the flood. Well, I don't know how they survive. And so it makes perhaps more sense to say they came out of the ark and they are now recolonizers of the land.
Yeah.
That's really complicated. Have I gotten that mostly right?
Yeah. Yeah. So one example that I think exemplifies both of the points that you've just made, the kind of restricted geographical extent of sediments in the Cenozoic compared to Mesozoic and older Paleozoic deposits, and also the nature of the rocks and the fossils that are in them, is the Green River Formation in Wyoming. And I think Marcus talked about this, where we have these deposits that are confined to particular basins, all within one state, basically, in Wyoming. So they're quite geographically restricted. So they're much smaller in scale. They have a very strange distribution of sediments in that they have a kind of bullseye pattern of sedimentation within these basins. So you have coarse sediments with large grain sizes at the edges. And then as you go inward, you get finer sediments. So you have this sort of concentric bullseye pattern that looks like the deposits of a lake confined within that basin. And then you also have other features of these deposits that fit that sort of lake interpretation. So you have different styles of preservation of the fish, depending on whether they're in the deep part of the basin or whether they're in the shallower parts of the basin. And around the margins, you have ripple marks and mud cracks and animal tracks and little algal mounds and things like this. So it sort of looks like a lake ecosystem in these Wyoming basins. And so you have something that is much more geographically limited in scope, and it looks like a terrestrial ecosystem. And the Green River Formation is Eocene in age, which is very low down in the Cenozoic. So it's the second subdivision of the Cenozoic. So you have Paleocene, then you have the Eocene. And it's the Eocene where you have this. And you also have similar deposits. Geological setting is a bit different, but there's an Eocene lake system in Germany. I've visited the site. It's the Messel oil shale.
Okay.
Quite similar, a fairly small sort of area, but you have what looks like a lake ecosystem. So this was one of the things that Marcus sort of focused on, this what seems to be a major shift in the scale and the nature of sedimentary deposits as you cross that Mesozoic to Cenozoic boundary. Even though, as you say, often the volume of these sediments is very large. So you have these very large sort of coastal deposits, very thick deposits along the margins of mountain belts, very thick coal deposits, very thick offshore sands. So the volume is big, but the geographical distribution and the nature of the sediments is a bit different.
Yeah. And I think that's, from my non-geological standpoint, that sounds like something that we really ought to pay attention to, not just a one-dimensional evaluation of volume, but a full appreciation of exactly what it is that we're looking at, right? Because volume may make us think, ooh, this must be something huge that did this. But then when you realize it's actually just, here's a big chunk here, and here's a big chunk there, and here's a big chunk there. It's not a continental-wide deposition, then, okay, well, maybe I am not interpreting it correctly. I don't know. I think another one of Marcus's points that he made pretty extensively was this idea about, and this one I think was really technical. I don't know if our audience really picked up on this one, but this idea of terrestrial animals that cross the boundary. My understanding of the argument goes like this. So before the flood, the continents are in a different configuration, and animals are living wherever they're living. And then God says, Noah, build an ark. And so the animals come. He brings the animals, two of every kind, to the ark. Now they're going to survive the flood in the ark, and then they're going to spread back out. Meanwhile, all the other animals outside of the ark die in the flood. And as a result of that, some of them are also going to be buried as fossils. Not all of them. And so
not necessarily where they were living either, because they could well have been transported.
Correct. Yes.
Prior to being buried.
Yes. So if you think about what we said there with the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic having these massive layers of rock that are extensive across major parts of continents and multiple continents, you can imagine, someone living in Boston could get washed out to sea, and that body could be buried in Dublin or something, right? So a completely different place than where they were living. Okay, so the animals then get off the ark, two of every kind, and they start dispersing. So they're reproducing and making more animals, and then they're spreading out from the ark. And in that process, then I would expect everything to be pretty jumbled and random. I would think, okay, well, these animals are just going to go wherever the climate is good, and I would not expect the rocks under their feet to have anything to do with the animals living on top, right? Because the continents have been rearranged and reconfigured. Climate zones are now different than they were before, in the sense that they're not in the same places that they were before. And so animals are going to go where they're suited climatically, and who knows what's under their feet. But if you look at, say, a flood boundary that's high up, right, towards the Ice Age, if you will, then you have a large number of fraction of animals that just happen, air quotes, just happen to go back and settle on literally the fossilized remains of their relatives. Which strikes me as really weird. How does that happen? Why does that happen? Then he said, well, if you try to do that same sort of boundary crossing experiment and study, who crosses the boundary down by the KPG boundary, the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic that he favors as the post-flood boundary, then you get a far lower number, a far lower frequency of terrestrial animals crossing the boundary, where they are literally living in places where their fossils are already found. That strikes me as a really important point, right? Because I find it I just find it hard to believe that this is going to happen on any large scale that you're going to have creatures coming back that just happen to be living on tops of the graves of Aunt Myrtle and Grandma and so forth. Because there's nothing on the surface that would give you any clue that that's the case. There's no climate continuity between that particular rock where it landed in the whole plate tectonic shuffle and where it was to begin with. So it seems to me more reasonable to go with a place where there's a much, much sharper distinction between the animals that are fossilized in the lower layers and the animals that are fossilized later. Have I got that mostly right? I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, Marcus is saying we should really, in terms of looking for the post-flood boundary, looking for where there is a pretty stark fossil break, where you don't have that kind of continuity. Because, as you say, it would be, you might expect by chance a few animals might end up settling after the flood in the places where their dead ancestors happened to be buried during the flood.
Sure.
But that's not going to happen very often.
I would hope not.
So you would
think not.
No, so you would expect that you would have a pretty low percentage of animals that are crossing a post-flood boundary.
Right.
And right. Marcus's point was that the KPG boundary is a much more likely candidate than a high flood boundary because you have relatively few boundary crossing animals at that point, but you have quite a high percentage of boundary crossing animals at the higher flood boundary.
Right.
And statistically, just thinking about the probabilities, it just seems unlikely.
Yeah.
Marcus also, because one of the points is when Marcus did that experiment looking at the lower flood boundary, the numbers still came out at something like 14% of the animals were crossing the boundary, and even that seems a bit uncomfortably high. But Marcus's response to that was to say, well, his data set didn't include pterosaurs or birds, which almost by definition are animals that don't cross the boundary. Yeah. So he was saying if I did the analysis and included pterosaurs and birds, that would probably bring the numbers down. And also, quite a number of those boundary crossing animals were small animals that are just represented by teeth and isolated bits of bone. And Marcus was saying we know there has been some reworking at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. So reworking is where you have fossils in an older layer of sediment that get exposed by erosion and then reincorporated into a younger sediment.
Okay.
So the animals themselves weren't actually alive. They weren't actually crossing the boundary. They just appeared to cross the boundary because their fossils have been exhumed and reburied.
Got it.
And he was saying, you can't do that with whole skeletons, whole articulated skeletons. That's not going to work. But if you've got isolated teeth and bones, then that reworking happens. And he was saying, again, when you take that into account, he thinks the 14%, it's probably going to come down to something like 5%, which, seems, he was arguing, within the kind of chance, the realms of chance.
Yeah.
So that was the argument. Yeah, he argues there is a much more distinctive fossil break at that point in the fossil record.
Yeah. Okay. Clarity. I don't know.
Yeah. It's hard. It's technical, isn't it? And we're trying to get our heads around these arguments. Yeah.
It's technical, but it's also, I think, if we want to shift gears a little bit into our own evaluation here, I think there's really important things said on both sides that we really need to wrestle with. And I want to preface this just a personal note here. When you're a public creationist, right, and you're writing a lot of stuff, which I am. 20 some years ago, I wrote a book called Understanding the Pattern of Life. That's a whole story in itself. In the book, I adopted the KPG as my flood post-flood boundary. At the time, I don't know anything about geology. I'm not a geologist. I don't know a granite from a, I can't even think of an example. So that's how ignorant I am of geology. So, but at the time I looked around and I said, okay, well, these geologists that I know who are creationists operate with that assumption. And these other people who are sort of critics of them, they tend to be not PhD geologists. It seemed to me that the preponderance of PhD geologists were telling me it's probably the KT. It's probably the KPG boundary, that boundary between the dinosaurs and the mammals. And so I thought, okay, cool. I will go with that because that seems to be the consensus. Not exactly a consensus, but it seems to be the consensus, the majority position of the people who ought to know, right? The people with PhDs. And some people, I think, have taken that to mean Todd Wood is absolutely, I don't know, zealously committed to this. I am not. I am not a geologist. I don't feel like I guess if I have a dog in the fight, it's when I see people being treated poorly. I don't like that. But ultimately, if anything that I've learned over the past 20 years, everything's more complicated than you seem to think. And so, I'm coming to this with I don't know. I don't think open mind is the right phrase, but I'm coming to this genuinely curious and genuinely interested in learning more about these questions because I don't know. Now, Paul, you have a slightly different situation because you've actually written on this subject and you are a geologist with a degree in geology, 2 degrees in geology. You know rocks better than I do. So you've sort of taken, you've written, as I said, on the subject, and you have an opinion, an assessment for us.
I do.
So could you, before we get into just what the answer is, because that's to me a very bland and boring question, because we're probably all wrong anyway. Because we're always oversimplifying something. So what do you think are the more important ways of thinking about this question? Maybe that's the better issue to think about here.
Well, before I come to that, and you might have to remind me what the question was in a moment, but I just want to just mention that I do have a bit of a backstory here because I have written on this subject, and if you look at my published work over the years on this subject, you will not see a consistent position.
That's right. You changed your mind.
My position has changed. I've probably at one time or another held almost every position there is on the post-flood boundary. So my position has shifted. So I am not averse to changing my mind when I think the evidence warrants it. I hope not. So the position I currently hold is not the position that you will see if you look back at, say, stuff I was publishing in the mid-90s. But I have published more recently, and I've tended to come down on a particular, viewpoint, which we'll maybe come to.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Both of the guests that we had on made some very important points and raised some quite difficult questions. And I think they underline to us that this is a hard and a complex question. It's not one we're going to solve in this short series. But I think there are some things that I think we just need to remind ourselves about and reflect on as we think about how do we evaluate. One thing that I think we need to remind ourselves about is something we said right at the beginning of this series, which is that there almost certainly is not a single boundary everywhere. Because we know from the Bible that the flood although it ended when Noah left the ark, that does not leave a geological signature.
Right.
And we cannot infer from the fact that Noah was able to leave the ark wherever the ark landed, that the whole of the world was therefore dry and the flood was over. I think we have reasons to believe from Scripture itself that the end of the flood was a gradual process. It was not a kind of one-time event that happened synchronously everywhere.
Right.
And that means, I think, that it's going to be very hard to define the flood post-flood boundary, and it is probably different from place to place. Exactly where we want to put the and it kind of depends how you want to define what the boundary is. What do you mean by the end of the flood? Even that's because it's a process.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I think we need to remind ourselves about. Another thing, as I was sort of reflecting on this, is a kind of methodological question. And I think this is what you were sort of alluding to a few minutes ago. How should we decide what weight we should place on different types of evidence? When we have data that appears to point maybe in conflicting directions, how do we assess that? What do we give priority to, and what do we think is a kind of secondary matter? And that's not an easy question. I think one of the things that we haven't done well in this debate is to actually think about the methodology of how we approach the question. I think too often what we do is we kind of plunge in and we think, well, the evidence that persuades me ought to persuade everybody else, and it's just kind of obvious, and it's a slam dunk, and why are these other people being so intransigent that they won't accept the position that I hold? And I think that's all sort of very unhelpful. And one of the things that kind of struck me is that Tim placed a lot of weight on the geological data, which is understandable. He's a geologist. And Marcus placed quite a lot of weight. He spent a lot of time talking about the paleontological evidence, the fossil data, which is not surprising. He's a paleontologist. Now, that's not to say that either of them are uninterested in the other types of data. They both talked about other things too. But I think it does just help us partly, I think, to understand how different creationists can come to very different conclusions because of the way that we're weighting the importance of certain types of data.
Right.
And I just think as creationists, we need to think a bit more carefully about all of that. So those are just a couple of thoughts. And I've tried to hold back so far from sort of giving my... I mean, do you want me to...
Oh, I want to tell a story first.
Okay.
So a number of years ago, I was... we had a Origins conference in Colorado. And I was there early and took a little... I think, Paul, you might have gone with us on this little tour. We went to a fossil site there in Colorado where they had these massive tree stumps. Just massive tree stumps sitting there. And I remember seeing these 3 trees that had essentially grown from essentially a common root, right? They'd grown so close together that there was tissue continuity between them, and there they were. Now, they were truncated, so they were not full logs. They were sitting upright, and there were no roots. There was no root system, so it was pretty clear they had been, shall we say, catastrophically emplaced, right? So they had been moved from where they were growing. The roots had all knocked off. The top of the stem had all knocked off. Just the root ball was left, and they were there, and there were 3 of them there. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if that had happened if that had been transported a long ways, I would have expected those trees to break apart. So I thought this is evidence that this deposition catastrophic though it is probably post-flood. They couldn't have moved very far. This is Oligocene, by the way. And I was talking at the conference to a prominent proponent of the KPG boundary as the post-flood boundary. And I will leave him nameless. And I was describing this to him, and he said, yeah, those are probably post-flood. Those are probably trees from before the flood. And I said, wait a minute. It's Oligocene. It's clearly after. No. Yeah, because in his mind, you can have debris from before the flood sitting around, and it can be buried. And he didn't think the connection between the trees was all that impressive. He's like, root balls are really tough. Those trees are probably going to stay together pretty easily if they grew together that way. So I don't think that's impressive at all. So in his mind, these were pre-flood trees being deposited finally and fossilized in the Oligocene, which in his mind was, maybe a decade or two after the flood. So for me as a biologist trying to sort through this and go, oh, Oligocene, that's probably after the flood. Oh, look at these trees. They're growing together. That's probably not going to be transported very far. Now, that all went out the window. These are pre-flood trees being deposited in a post-flood environment. And so it's complicated. You think you understand it, and you don't.
Yeah.
At least I felt that way.
Yeah. And we need multidisciplinary work on this issue.
Yeah.
We certainly do.
Yeah.
Well, as we begin to sort of wind this up, maybe I should just close out with perhaps a bit of my own take. And
give us your thoughts on this. Where do you put the importance of these arguments and data?
Yeah, and perhaps lay my cards a bit on the table.
Sure,
yeah. One of the things that I like about the KPG boundary position is that it gives us a kind of coherent story about the Cenozoic. What would we expect after the flood? We'd expect a world that was drying out and cooling down. And when I look at the Cenozoic, that's kind of what I see. I see evidence in the vegetation and in the pollen record that we find in Cenozoic sediments and in microfossils and in analyses of isotopes within those microfossils. For example, oxygen isotopes in little single-celled microorganisms buried in ocean sediments that can act as a kind of paleothermometer, so giving us some clues about what the temperature was of the water in which these things were growing. One of the things that you see in the Cenozoic is you see evidence of a world that is drying, see a shift in the vegetation types, and you see a shift in the oxygen isotopes that implies that it was cooling down. And of course, this ultimately culminates in the growth of the ice sheets and the onset of the glaciation in the Pleistocene. But the rest of the Cenozoic provides a kind of backstory that helps you understand the Ice Age. It kind of it sets the scene for how the Ice Age happens. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the fossil record of macrofossils, we also see some interesting trends through the Cenozoic. So we talked in this podcast some episodes ago with Tim Brophy about horse fossils. And we see some interesting trends in the horse fossils. We have the earliest horses in the Eocene are these small horses with multiple toes. They have browsing teeth. And as you go up through the Cenozoic sediments, you see other types of horses. You see a kind of a trend from browsing to grazing teeth, a transition. You see a trend in reduction of toes, culminating in the horse that we have today with a single hoof. And you see an overall trend in increase in size. And all of those trends kind of make sense in terms of the climatic changes that seem to be evidenced in the Cenozoic in the other types of data that I've just talked about. So these changes seem to track a kind of cooling and drying climate. Now that seems quite appealing to me, because it seems to me when you look at the Cenozoic, there is a consistent, coherent story of recovery after the flood and diversification of animals tracking the kinds of climatic changes that you would expect in a recovering post-flood world. And so really for me, that's one of the reasons I favour the KPG boundary. I'm also quite impressed, I think, with the fossil evidence that Marcus talked about in terms of, the percentages of boundary crossing animals.
Right.
That seems, it's difficult for me to see how you can have high numbers of boundary crossing animals, if that's the post-flood boundary, because it just defies all the odds to have the animals going back to where their ancestors were being buried during the flood. So my working model at the moment would be similar to the model that Marcus has propounded, recognizing, however, that Tim has raised a number of questions for which I do not have a good answer. So I think particularly when Tim talks about the amount of tectonic changes after the flood, the production of the ocean crust, and when he talks about the volume of some of the Cenozoic sediments, those things do really give me pause to stop and think, and I don't think I've got good answers to them. I think we need to do more research. I think we need to all work together and ideally come up with a model that explains as much of the data as we can. I think the worst thing would be if, as creationists, we kind of retreated into our sort of ghettos and didn't talk to one another, or just hurled rocks at one another because we have different positions on some of these things. I think we need to be talking to one another and trying to solve some of the problems and, work together on the problems, because Tim has definitely raised some things that have me scratching my head and that have given me a lot of things to think about. And I like I say, I don't always have good answers to them.
Yeah. My own work on hominins, studying ancient humans after the flood, I'm running into these caves in the Middle East that are formed in Cenozoic limestone that contain Neanderthals. Now we've got copious, Bronze Age stuff that's clearly biblical archaeology. No Neanderthals in any of that. So apparently the Neanderthals were there and gone before those sort of Bronze and Iron Age deposits were left. And how is there a cave? Right?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah.
I don't know how you make it.
Yeah.
How do you lay down a rock layer, carve out the cave, and then have Neanderthals move into it? All of it happening before Abraham shows up on the scene. That's not a lot of time. So I'm left kind of scratching my head as well, trying to think through all these issues. And it is not easy. I think everybody's got some good points, and we're all going to have to sort of think more carefully and more deliberately about everything. Well, I think we've run out of time. We may have gone a little long on this episode, but it's a fascinating discussion. And so thank you so much. And I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed this series. We haven't come to any hard conclusions, and I think that's good. It leaves us wanting more, and hopefully some young person out there is listening going, you haven't thought about this, and is going to come up with the answer to everything. So let's pray that that's the case. So thanks, Paul. And I guess we'll be back here in a fortnight with another episode. And it'll be a completely different episode topic and a completely different subject. So if you're tired of geology and you don't have any idea what we're talking about boundaries, The end is near. The end is near. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.